that supports the world, that creates the greatest amount of good. Now for some definitions of what exactly Senate Bill 50 is, or what exactly the transit housing bill is. Senate Bill 50, or SB 50, is the measure that would quote-unquote upzone land within California that is currently dedicated to single-family housing and build duplexes, triplexes, etc. in these areas. In larger counties, would primarily be in larger counties and would target areas that currently have a lot of areas that are targeting a lot of that are causing a lot of people to come into the city. For example, rail stations, job clusters, good schools, etc. So it would be targeting these areas that already have a lot of people who want to live there right now. And it would allow in many areas, it would allow four or more housing units to be built where currently only a single housing unit can be built. Thus, our plan text is going to be the resolution that the state of California should pass Senate Bill 50, or the Transit Housing Bill. Our first advantage, or first reason why this plan text is a good idea, is that of housing. First, let's look at what's happening in the status quo right now. Firstly, we see that there's a huge housing crisis, especially within California, because according to the McKinsey Institute, California has 3.4 million fewer homes than it needs for the households that live within California right now, or that want to live within California. This means that not only are lower income people being priced out, but essentially everyone doesn't even have the opportunity to move to California in the first place because of the shortage of housing that we're experiencing. But secondly, this is causing houses to be extremely expensive because people are unable to buy houses, and because there's so little supply that only the richest of the rich can really afford to live here. In San Francisco, for example, the median price of a home is over $830,000. And as a result, 1/4 of the homeless people who live within the United States total live within California, which is almost 60,000 homeless people. California has tried to target and has tried to help these homeless people get out of homelessness, but that is ultimately impossible when we have such a huge shortage of homes and when homes are so expensive. But in addition, more than 1/2 of home buyers in San Francisco in the last year had high-paying software jobs. I'll talk about more later on why even high-paying jobs aren't enough to get people housing, but we see that right now, the only people who can afford to move towards California are those who have really, really high-paying jobs and have already established themselves in their careers. Thirdly, California refuses to address these issues. According to the LA Times, 80% of California is reserved solely for single-family homes, which means that we're unable to solve all of these harms that we're seeing right now in the status quo because California is refusing to take action to change this. But let's look at what our plan does to change this. Firstly, our plan means that 43% of the land in many cities within California, including Los Angeles, will be impacted in that many of these lands that have been set apart for single-family housing units will allow multiple families to live in these units and to live in these areas. Secondly, the bill also means that there's going to be more houses that are built, simply for the reason that where there's now currently only one family living, there can now be, for example, 4 families living in the same amount of space, especially because these houses can now be built to be multiple stories rather than simply 1-story or 2-story homes. This means that there's going to be more houses and an increase in supply of houses within California. This alone will be enough not only to provide housing to a lot of the people who can't afford it or who can't access it because it simply doesn't exist, but will also decrease prices due to the fact that there's more supply to actually match some of the demand. But thirdly, this bill also requires projects that are building 11 or more units to provide affordable housing and has price controls that increase depending on how many housing units that you're building. This means that for large industrial housing projects that are going on within California, they would have to be price controlled and they would have to provide affordable housing to people who right now cannot afford it. Thus, the impacts of this first is going to be that of poverty and homelessness. I'll get to at the bottom of this argument, because we would be decreasing poverty and homelessness, or at least make homes more accessible to people within California if we actually allow them to have access to homes within the area and if we build more homes as well. Secondly, this also improves quality of life because it means that people are actually able to live in areas where they have things such as career opportunities or are able to have homes to reside in the first place. Yes?
You talked about price control. Like, where is that coming from? Where's the concept of price control coming from exactly? Could you restate that?
Okay, so the bill requires projects with 11 or more units to provide affordable housing and has price controls on these units depending, for example, a housing project that builds 20 units would have higher price controls and would mandate that these houses be sold for less money than a project that only provided, for example, 11 housing units. All right, going on to our second advantage, or second reason why the plan is a good idea, which is that of the economy. This advantage is going to talk about how right now, even people in the technological sector are unable to access a lot of the homes within California, which prevents the innovation and the economy from growing. But firstly, what's happening in the status quo? Right now, California is already a hub of companies when it comes to technology development, and it holds the most headquarters than any other state within the United States. Many companies, including Apple, Oracle, Google, Facebook, and Intel, all hire a vast amount of people within places such as Silicon Valley. San Francisco, as a result, has the highest concentration of high technology companies, with Silicon Valley holding 225,300 high-tech jobs within that area alone. However, many of these people have to commute from far away from Silicon Valley because they're simply unable to access the homes that simply do not exist right now in the status quo. Secondly, there's a huge shortage of tech workers. The National Association of Manufacturing reports that the United States will have to fill 3.5 million STEM jobs by 2025 to match the growing demand for technology that is becoming more and more prevalent within our daily lives. However, 2 million of those jobs are currently unfilled, and many of them are expected to remain unfilled in the years to come. Thirdly, is that tech companies cannot attract a lot of people because of high housing prices within California right now. We are a hub of innovation and we are a hub of technology, but many people, even those who work in technology, simply cannot afford to live here unless they're already well established and high up in a company already. And fourthly, according to Vox, even tech workers, as a result, can't afford housing. The average value of a house within the San Francisco area starts at $1.34 million, but that has a down payment of up to $250,000 every single year, simply because people can't afford the original cost. And yet many of these houses remain unoccupied because people still can't afford them. 70% of tech workers also report that they are unable to actually pay to live in the places where they work right now. Now let's look at what our plan is to change this. Our plan essentially increases housing and decreases prices of housing, which means, as I talked about in our previous advantage, which means that people are actually able to access the areas where they are working right now. This encourages more people to come to Silicon Valley, invest in technology, and improve the innovation that is so important to our daily lives. Thank you.
Howdy, everyone. Opponents, are you ready? Partner, are you ready? Judges, are you ready? Okay, perfect. I'm assuming spectators are ready. And with that, my time will start now. Hello, judges. My name is Aiden McIver, and I stand on the firmest negation on the resolution resolve the state of California should enact SB 50, the Transit Housing Bill. Now, first off, Judge, I'll be going over the affirmations case and explain to you why all of their impacts don't flow in today's round and why they don't actually provide the net benefits that they say they do. So their first contention was of housing. They talked about the huge housing crisis right now occurring. So they bring out an inherency, essentially, and how what they're trying to do is basically say that they solve for this issue. They have the solvency to this inherency. However, Judge, they talk about that there's a 4.3 million household deficit, essentially, that people that can't get homes, like 4.3 million houses missing and such. They talk about houses being very expensive and how the median price in San Francisco is over $830,000. Here's the issue, though. Just by enacting this bill does not actually guarantee that you're lowering the price, and here's why. This ties into gentrification, but essentially, if you build a duplex or whatnot, and they say that the price control is about 11 units or not, but here's the issue. So big monopolizers, big investments, venture capitalists are going to look at these buildings being built now, and now they're just going to buy them out and rent them out. Prices realistically aren't going to drop, but even then, they don't give us an example of how much the price is going to drop by, so how do we know it's even going to be affordable? What's proving that? Where's that link there? Explain to me how the supply, like how much is it going to lower by? If it only lowers it by 10 grand, is it really that big of a difference? Is it actually going to make a dent in people being able to afford housing? Absolutely not. So their first impact was that 43% of the land will be impacted. There's going to be multiple family homes. I'll be explaining why this is a bad thing, having so many people in a close proximity. And secondly, it's going to improve quality of life. But again, most of their arguments are predicated on the housing value going down. There's no proof of this statement. They don't give really any idea except the concept of supply and demand, which many housing venturists, people that specialize in housing and real estate agents disagree with. They don't believe that this is true whatsoever. Also, they talked about multiple families living here, multiple rich families, mind you. Again, we tie this into gentrification, but I'll be going more into that, how that functions. So now we go to the second contention, just very quickly. That was of the economy. Essentially, California is a hub of tech companies. Again, this same exact contention of people being able to get houses closer to their jobs because of having to commute. This is predicated on the idea that houses will be affordable. So I wouldn't flow either of their contentions unless they can prove to you that there's actually going to be a change in how much the housing is going to be affected by. If it's not being affected, then how do we know any of these things are going to happen? So basically, their plan does two things. They increase housing, decrease price. Yes, they increase housing, but there's nothing that actually validifies the statement that they're going to decrease the price in any way. So now we go into the negations case, which we're going to be cross-applying quite a bit and explain to you what's going on. So first contention of the negation, or first disad, bill will only benefit developers, increase land values, resulting in gentrification. So first off, Los Angeles Tenants Union and Housing is a Human Right, both are organizations located in California, strongly reject the supply and demand theory of housing that the bill is founded on. So first, I'm going to explain to you how gentrification is bad. So gentrification is bad because it occurs with new developments. Affluent people will essentially buy the large scale areas to rent out, eventually getting more expensive businesses, starting the gentrification process. So it's basically new wave colonialism, economic, societal, and public health repercussions when it comes to this. Let's go to the first premise of this though. So let's say someone's moving in this community to help, right? And they're gonna start beautification projects, community programs and such like that. It's gonna raise the property value as a whole when we start these new duplexes and such. So housing itself is actually gonna go up regardless because people are moving into these areas. Secondly, when these neighborhoods are gentrified, those moving in are looking for cheap rent and the ability to make a better life for themselves. So if you're affluent, you're moving into a low income housing area, you're not realistically here necessarily to help, and you're gonna like slowly over time start raising like the prices just by like, it'll explain further as I go down. Wealthier people move in, landlords are gonna start raising rent. That's how it ties in. So let's say I'm moving into rent, right? Landlords are gonna anticipate this, realizing, hey, this guy is a multi-millionaire, I can raise my rent to whatever I want. So, and they talk about price control, but that's only with 11 units. So we're talking about 11 units and below. They didn't really give us an idea of like what percentage of these buildings are gonna be 11 units or more where they can actually price control, and how much are they price controlling by. Secondly, they talk about, we bring up that median rent prices in New York City rose 75% since 2001. The trend is also seen in Oakland, California. Again, gentrification is a huge issue for poor income and low income families, especially minorities. Also, local businesses suffer as large competitors start opening shops in previously undesirable areas. So, for instance, Starbucks will start opening up in these areas if more affluent people are moving in because they realize this is a good market, we can make more money this way. Also, people of color are criminalized as new people feel in danger because, again, media kind of portrays people that aren't white to be almost criminal-like, and if you're moving in an area with predominantly that, we're going to see an increase in like police brutality because they're going to start calling the police on people that they think are criminals but have no actual reason to be. Take example Trayvon Martin, who was killed by someone just for being black. Another thing is, we talk about the education of children suffers. When the rent raises, there's going to be, they're going to have to move because if the rent's raising, they have to move, which is going to disrupt the learning of the children. Also, health of residents suffer. CDC reports that when neighborhoods change rapidly, it pushes residents to the margin. They gentrify, so they move to a new area where they actually have less walkable streets, further distances to drive, and industrial pollutants near housing. So again, they have to move to an even worse area than they were before because gentrification occurred, and now they're going to have to face environmental impacts that affect their health. So why is it that poor communities of color have spent years battling disinvestment and abandonment, but we change that now just to assist white people into getting these neighborhoods and having better housing? Yeah, really.
On the point about how people are going to have to move further away and drive further distances, that would be also cross-applied to our environmental contention about how people are going to be having to drive further, which then negatively impacts the environment through emissions.
Okay, so just to restate that real quick, if they're having to commute further, there's going to be more emissions, which is going to hurt the environment, which again, they don't solve for. Second contention is that of health. Assertion, with more zoning for housing being put in place, it will create a problem with overpopulation that can put the general health of the population living in these areas at risk. Evidence, in these areas there will be more vehicles on the road. Vehicles emit smog. According to Healthline, quote unquote, exposure to smog can lead to several different types of short and long-term respiratory health conditions. So second evidence, this is that disease. Britannica states that the population density can help to faster the spread of disease. Thirdly, Dr. John B. Calhoun found a link between overpopulation and an increase in mental health detriments. He found in cities suicide was more prevalent when compared to that of an equivalent ratio in lessly dense areas. So we can see there's definitely mental health issues and also physical health issues. Let's go to the impact. Enacting this law would see an increase in the population of these urban areas with a higher population, already densely populated areas like San Francisco and Los Angeles. We will see a negative effects for the people who live and work in these places overall, harming them and not providing net benefits. Let's go to the third and final contention, and we believe what is unique to that side of the negation. That is the environmental impact. Assertion. Enacting this law would create a situation that could potentially put the environment at risk. Evidence one, in more densely populated areas, there will be more cars on the road. That is just a simple fact. It makes logical sense. If you have more people living in an area, you're going to have automobiles. They're going to use the automobiles to move to work. Second evidence of this is that the resource that it takes to create these buildings that are newly zoned could affect the environment with the use of resources and with potentially harming the immediate environment. We're in a drought right now, or we were in a drought, but there's definitely going to be there's definitely chances of having it happen again. Like water supplies are not that great in California right now. We keep building duplexes with more showers and toilets. It's always going to affect our water supply even more. Evidence three, more people will be using water in this area too, and that can be harmful because we just got out of a drought. impact. The increase in population can see a larger amount of environmental harms that harm the world at large and can hurt the local environment as well. This negatively impacts people, which harms net benefits. So again, Judge, we provide you net harms as to what's going on and how we solve for that. We don't harm the environment, but the affirmation does. A lot of their arguments are predicated on price and lowering of price, but they don't understand how the housing market works. It doesn't function like that. And so I urge you to vote on firmness and engagement. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Chan. I'll be the second speaker for the affirmation side. The order of my speech will be there are 3 disadvantages in order, and then our 2 advantages. On the first dissad on gentrification, the overview here is that the negative makes a fatal flaw when they misunderstand what affordable housing is. They talk about gentrification, about how big corporations are essentially going to take over, and supply and demand does not actually apply to this situation. However, we look to the fact that if anything, gentrification occurs right now. We only decrease it because we create more affordable housing. They say that we don't know what the price is and what's the maximum cap. However, Judge, there's a clear definition of what affordable housing is, as stated under federal law. What affordable housing is, as it's a definition that the government uses. This is directly tied to the incomes of the people that are buying those houses. So it's directly tied to make sure that they won't have to face shortages such as food and shelter and a lot of dehumanizing conditions. So we see that affordable housing is going to solve for their gentrification because the law requires that they have affordable housing, which once again is tied to the incomes of the buyers of those homes to make sure that they can still afford food and education at the same time. It's going to ensure that essentially that the government or these big corporations aren't going to increase these housing prices to drastic amounts because once again the law requires affordable housing as defined by the federal government. Next, they talk about how more wealthy people will move in. However, we see once again affordable housing is going to solve. But even if you don't buy their argument, we see that all their arguments about gentrification is happening right now, Judge. Only the wealthy people are able to get the homes in the United States because they're extremely overpriced. However, people who are of low income cannot afford these houses and are thus pushed to the curb and forced to live homelessly. Yeah.
So you talked about federal housing. What is the definition then? So, what is
Okay,
the
well,
affordable
I
housing?
can't. Yeah, it's below the medium income. And okay. Anyway, once again, affordable housing solves it. Even if you don't buy it, we see the wealthy are the only ones that can afford these houses in this status quo, which is what's happening right now. However, under our plan, we're actually going to increase the amount of housing that people have access to. Also, you're going to look to basically basic economics of supply and demand. We look to the fact that because there's such high demand for houses within California, the prices are at really high. What this means is, however, if we're going to decrease the demand by increasing the amount of houses, these big corporations have no way to sell their houses if they're at super high prices because there's not enough demand. Right now, there's too much demand and no supply. However, if we increase the supply, there's going to be decreasing demand, and thus the housing prices are going to be lower. Also, it's probably going to be more profitable to make the housing prices lower because so many people want to live in California. They talk about how large businesses are going to take over. Once again, we can look to the fact that this is not unique to what's happening right now because you live in Silicon Valley, we look to big corporations and headquarters such as Apple and Google who are already basically capitalizing on California. So when they talk about small businesses, that does not apply. They talk about how people of color are criminalized. However, that's what's happening in this status quo. We look to Oakland specifically where there's a mass exodus of people because of rising housing prices. This specifically targets people of color, meaning you can turn all their links because we actually increase housing prices and decrease prices. Once again, they talk about how people are going to move to a worse area. However, they won't have to move under affordable housing, which is directly tied to the buyer's income, and thus they will not have to leave. On their disadvantage on health. Here they talk about disease and overpopulation. However, the overview here is that there's already overpopulation. It's just that even because there's overpopulation, so many people are basically forced to live on the curbs and live without hope. So we have 2 responses to their argument about health. The first response is that there's so many other factors for example, mental illnesses, such as the weather and other things like that, meaning this is a very small factor. When they say there's a correlation between population, that's probably not very big, and there's so many However, the second response is that this is already happening in the status quo. There's so many people living in California, however, there's not enough homes to fit them. This means that people are going to, once again, be homeless, as my partner has already said. However, we don't actually increase the population, we just increase the amount of housing that people can actually afford. On their disadvantage on automobiles, they talk about how we're going to increase the water supply. However, people are still using water. Once again, like I said, there's already overpopulation. Everybody's using water. It's a matter of whether or not they can use water inside the comfort of their own home. However, we're actually going to say that we're going to increase the environment by using cleaner water because of the fact that when people are homeless, they have less access to clean water and water that's worse for the environment. They have to turn to more environmentally detrimental methods to get their water. However, if they live in homes, this is actually more drought effective. Also, they talk about commuting to work. However, we look to the fact that in the status quo, people have to commute 1.5 hours on average to their jobs because they cannot afford the houses that are directly near their jobs. What this means is that all the things about automobiles are already happening right now. We only have a chance of solving because we decrease the amount of time that people have to commute because they have more access to affordable housing. On our advantage on housing. So essentially, their only response here, their only blanket response was that of gentrification, which I already touched on. However, they talk about how investors are going to buy it out. We have three responses. The first response is once again that of affordable housing. There's no way, because by law, they must make it affordable for low-income people below the median income line. However, the second response is even if these houses are expensive, there's still more. So right now, what's happening right now is not good. We only have a chance of solving. Even if we can see the fact that they're going to be expensive, even though they're not going to be expensive, it's still better than having no houses whatsoever. But the third response is that of supply and demand. This is like economics 101. If there's no demand for this housing because everybody's of low income, there's no sales. They're going to have to decrease prices in order to accommodate people who cannot afford these super high prices. However, they talk about how supply and demand is false judge. They only cite other economists, but they don't actually say why supply and demand is false. If they don't give you no logical any empirics or any warrantation, you probably shouldn't be buying this argument. Also, to the point where they have no empirics for why it's going to lead to gentrification, they just say the term. That probably means you shouldn't buy their logical chain of arguments, as that's their only response. What this means is that you can flow all of our arguments about how 43% of the land is going to be impacted. This also means that there's going to be more houses and decreased prices because there's going to be a price cap judge. The California legislators specifically passed this bill knowing that they could not let gentrification happen, and thus they put a cap on prices to make sure that low-income families are able to afford it without having to miss out on education and food. Also, look to the fact that, as my partner said, when these houses have 11 plus units, once again, they have to be affordable, and they put price controls as stated by the federal government of what affordable housing is. That leads us to the second advantage, which is that of the economy. The overview here is that basically they concede all what we say is happening right now in the status quo. We tell you that we're on a brink, especially because of the trade war. We see our GDP has decreased by almost half of a percentage point, which is a huge amount of our economy. Also, look to the fact that we're losing a lot of jobs and increase of unemployment because of the trade war. What this means, we're on a brink scenario, and we're likely going to head to a recession, as a lot of economists believe that we're going to be in a recession because of the trade war. However, we see that they say it's not going to be affordable. Once again, we give you three reasons for why this is actually going to be affordable. However, even if you don't buy that, as long as we increase houses, it's always going to be a net benefit to having no houses whatsoever. We tell you that there's a shortage of 3.5 million STEM jobs, and 2 million of them go unfilled. We also tell you that tech companies make up 5% of the GDP, so in order to save the economy for strong bones, there is affirmation side.
Give me a moment. I'm trying to load this. Through their plan, they effectively crash the housing market. Partner, do you want to elaborate on this?
So when there's more homes in the housing market, that means the houses are going to be cheaper. All houses are going to be cheaper. If all houses are cheaper, that means the equity in your house is going to go down. So if you buy a house for $500,000 and it was
was $700,000, but now all houses prices go down. You lose that equity, so now you're at 300 grand, which means you can't use the equity that you had to get your loan to refinance. You can't pay off your loan, so it means you have to default on your loan, which means the house forecloses your home, which means you lose your house.
Okay, now to rephrase that so some judges don't flow questions like that. So more homes equals cheaper, all houses go down, equity in housing is lost, bankruptcy, people can't refinance their house to pay it off, and people lose their homes. Now that's important because when the affirmation's entire plan and the net benefits that they're trying to give to people is that we're going to allow for more people inside of homes, we're going to help to solve for homelessness, they actually create quite the inverse of that. And now, with that out of the way, I'm going to be getting into the reputations that they made towards our case. First off, I'm going to start with the claim that they made, that they said that when we asked the question about what is affordable housing, they said that affordable housing is below the median income. A refutation we have towards this, looking at their case, their entire case is on the premise of a couple of things. Number one, we're trying to decrease homelessness. And number two, we're trying to get people to move in to work tech jobs that aren't currently being filled. But the problem is when people are moving from somewhere else, maybe not even the state of California, their income is lower than the median income in California. Like, the average income in the United States is substantially lower than it is in places like San Francisco. So these people might not even be able to afford to even move in the first place because, again, the median income, below the median income is different throughout the whole country. So for their entire point about them trying to solve for getting more people to move in, well, that doesn't necessarily solve for it because median income is different all over the country. So people might not still might not be able to afford to live here. Second, they said that they decreased gentrification with their plan. But again, what about all the programmers that they want to attract to move in here? So all these people are, programmers are coming from more educated backgrounds. These educations cost a lot of money. They would have gone through college, right? So more likely than not, these people are probably from higher class backgrounds. So it will inherently, by their own impacts, create gentrification. The next is that they said the law requires price control. How does it necessarily determine price control? They said the median income, but again, this is only in places where there's 11 houses or more, or 11 units or more. What happens with units that aren't like that? And any investor worth their salt is going to figure out some sort of way on paper to make it look like each system is not 11 units and above, yes?
I also want to talk about the fact that when all the houses are gone, that means rich investors who have a lot of money in other states that don't have this housing crisis happening are able to purchase a portfolio from the bank of foreclosed homes not supported by the affordable housing program, which then indirectly causes gentrification for the people that live in that neighborhood, which makes their housing even more expensive for them to afford their loans.
Yeah, exactly. How that ties back into our first observation is if all these houses are being lost, people are losing their homes, other investors are going to come in, buy them, and they don't have any obligation for price control, so why not just raise the prices? That's exactly what could happen. They don't solve for that. Our opponents don't solve for this. They claim that they should, but obviously it doesn't happen. Now on to the next point. They said that it's simply supply and demand. Well, supply and demand is actually negative for the people who already live in these areas. So why are we valuing people who don't live in areas over the people who do, the people who can potentially lose their homes? Now the next point, they said that people of color are being criminalized and are increasing housing prices, and these people have to leave. That's making the assumption, number one, that people of color are on average poorer, and number two, that these people are actually that they can't afford to live here. Number one, if they can't afford to live here, that means they're going to have to live somewhere else, or maybe even lose their job, which hurts the economics of this area. Because number one, these people don't have money to spend in these areas, which hurts the local economy. And next, it hurts job growth in the area too, because these people who are already rooted in these areas can't live here. And again, that also ties in, you can cross-apply that to our environmental point as well, because these people, if they do decide to keep their jobs, will have to commute further, which then helps to worsen climate change. Now, the next point that we're trying to make the next point that they make against our case is that, again, supply and demand creates a cheaper environment. My partner, I tag teamed him in, I reiterated it, we already talked about this. They already said, and now health, they said that there's already overpopulation. Okay, yeah, there's already overpopulation. That's an issue. We all agree that's an issue. But the thing is that the affirmation actually makes this problem even worse. So they can see that overpopulation is an issue, they can see that it creates health problems, and they can see that it creates mental health issues, but the whole problem is that they make it worse throughout their plan. The next thing is that they said that with an increase in pricing in houses, it will create more homelessness. But again, this neglects the other causes of homelessness. Homelessness can be attributed to many things, including mental health and including drug abuse, which are actually major factors in why people are homeless, especially since the opioid crisis is ravaging America as we speak. So when we talk about the fact that this will be the sole purpose that creates homelessness and that these people who are being affected will become homeless as a result, that's not necessarily true, because for the most part, people who don't suffer from addiction and people who don't suffer from mental health issues, for the most part, or have a higher likelihood of bouncing back on their feet instead of staying in homelessness like the affirmation wants you to believe. Now, the next point is that they said that in the status quo, people already commute. Yeah, they just make it worse for the disadvantaged people who are forced out of their homes to commute. So not only are you taking people who are disadvantaged economically, but you're forcing them to commute further, which is more expensive for them because gas is more expensive. And number two, it's more expensive to our environment because, again, it hurts our environment overall. Now, again, our environmental point, they kind of danced around it, but they really didn't hit our whole point about how we just got out of a drought. But that's the one point they actually did hit, is that we just got out of a drought and it could destabilize our water supply in the state of California. They said that homeless people have less access to clean water, and they needed it more. But the problem is that there is tons of access to clean water. There are clean water programs in homeless shelters as well as water fountains that are throughout all public spaces, including public parks. So for them to say that they don't have a lot of access to clean water is just kind of reaching and grabbing at our contentions and not really being able to hold on to anything. Now looking at their case, they said that housing and that they need more people to live in these. They need more people to live in these areas. That there's thousands of jobs, or there's millions of jobs in the STEM field that aren't being filled and that can be filled. Again, this will only create gentrification, since people who are coming from STEM educations are more likely to come from more, not affluent, but at least middle class families, and that this somewhat invasion of people inherently creates gentrification. So again, when you look at what they're saying, it's like you have to pick all of their arguments kind of weigh on the idea that supply and demand is good. But overall, all it does is just harm the people who are already living here and valuing people who are coming from other places to come and work. And those people are more well-educated and probably are white, whereas they're disadvantaging people who are economically disadvantaged. So when you take into account the economic disadvantage point, people are being thrown out of their homes to help other richer people. For that reason, please vote in the way of mitigation. Thank you very much for your time, judges.
Okay, Judge, I'll be going over one key voter issue, and that's about it. Judges ready? Opponents ready? Lovely. Partner, are you ready? Spectators, are you ready? All right, fantastic. With that, my time will start now. Hello, judges. My name is Aiden McKay. I'm backing up for the closing statements on the side of the negation. I'm first going to make an observation. Judge, this ballot ain't big enough for the both of us. Perfect. Okay, let's go on to the one and only key voter issue, that of weighing the difference. So, because we agreed to the affirmation's weighing mechanism and net benefits, just whoever can provide the most beneficial in this round. But as a negation, our burden is only to prove that the affirmation worsens the problem in the status quo. We don't need to provide an alternative, just prove that they do worse than the status quo does. So, here's our first issue here. As my partner mentioned, and when I tag team in, they literally caused another housing crisis. So, this is how this is going to function. You have more houses being built, right? Which means that all houses in general, following their concept of supply and demand, all houses are going to go down in price. If all houses go down in price, that means the equity of the house, the money that you're building in, because usually the price of houses goes up, okay? So you have a $500,000 house. Over time, the property value is going to go up. So your house becomes $600,000, $700,000, etc. So over time, when you have more houses, that means the current value of your home is going to go down, which means if you bought it at $500,000, it's now worth $400,000. So what did you just lose? Plus $300,000 worth of equity. If you lose that equity, that means you can't refinance that money you just got into paying off the loan for your house payments. If you can't pay off that loan, you have to default that loan. If you default that loan, the bank can legally foreclose your home. If they foreclose it, they put it into something called a portfolio, which leads to how rich people are able to access this type of building, because they can go to the bank, sit down with whoever they have the representative. They'll have an entire folder of a portfolio and say, here are 10 houses. This is called a monopoly. You can go ahead and buy this monopoly of 10 houses, and bam, they literally just bought 10 properties because with their plan, all housing has just went down. Not only are you ruining lower class families, you're also ruining middle class families. The only people that benefit from this are the higher class people
people that have houses in other areas that aren't being affected by this bill. So that's the first thing. They literally cause them their housing crisis. So even if they want to talk about getting more housing, if anything, more people become homeless because of this, because people get their houses foreclosed. Secondly, a lot of what the AF talked about was just how our plan doesn't solve for this. We're not trying to solve for it. We're just pointing out how the AF does it worse. By following their plan, the environmental issues are going to worsen. Gentrification is going to worsen. Like, we're literally just proving that to you. That is the only burden negation has in today's round, just proving that it's worse. A lot of things, they don't really explain how they're going to like provide for an environment besides saying that like closer industrial areas is going to do anything. They don't really address the public health like issue. If you have more people in densely populated areas, we literally provide you evidence as to how that causes mental health issues and like physical health issues. But they don't even refute that. So they don't really care about the welfare of the citizens in any way because they don't even talk about this whatsoever and how they're going to even try to solve for it. They just kind of let that go. If we talk about the environment in general, worsening the environment, their one response is how homeless people don't have access to water. But as my partner brings up, there are other public ways to get water. And even then, like, again, like, water supply itself is going to go down. Also, they don't really explain to us how is a homeless person going to afford a home? He doesn't have a job. I'm sorry, that's the status of what they are. They're not employed, that's why they're homeless. So, well, they don't have to necessarily be homeless, but they may not have like enough money to be able to purchase a home. So, judges, when I urge you to vote and when you're weighing on net benefits, this mechanism of who provides the most benefits. Give me a second. Can you tell me when you stop time at?
49 seconds.
49. Okay, good.
So POs were essentially saying that they can't bring up any new arguments in the rebuttal. So the argument about homeless people, about how they're not employed and thus in the world they can't afford any housing is new. That's me on your page.
Okay, all right, time start, no, I'm not gonna count down. All right, just disregard that then, that's fine. So overall though, judges, I wanna like urge you to vote on the negation just based on like weighing net benefits. Obviously, we are able to prove to you that the affirmation does not solve for this issue. They just worsen the housing like crisis already in the United States, especially in California, mainly. So again, if they're trying to solve for the housing crisis, having more affordable homes, yeah, they got what they wanted, more affordable homes, but no one else can like ever like get a loan realistically and actually refinance to purchase like their home that they need. So judges, that's why I urge you to vote on the affirmative negation on this resolution based on the fact that the affirmation causes a global recession and their plan literally worsens every issue that the negation brought up. Thank you.
Alright, so in my final speech, I'm going to cover the biggest issues on all parts of the debate. I'm going to start with an overview, and then I'll go into the disadvantages in order, and then the advantages in order. We all agree that issues like homelessness, overpopulation, the economy, and innovation are all issues in the world of the status quo right now. So in a world in which the ballot ain't big enough for both of us, you should vote for the team that actually has a risk of solving for any of the issues that my opponents talk about. When all of the disadvantages are completely non-unique to what's already happening in the status quo, we're going to argue that you should be voting on the risk of the advantages, because those are the impacts that we have the most change on, because they're not impacts that are already literally happening anyway. Now let's go on to the specific arguments that were made in this debate. Firstly, on the disadvantage. Now firstly, my opponents make this quote-unquote observation, where they say that we crashed the housing market and caused all houses to become cheaper, which eventually causes all these harms. Judge, firstly, this is a complete reverse from my opponent's original stance. Originally, they argued that we increased prices, and now they're saying that you decreased prices so much that suddenly they're going to increase in the future as well. This complete reversal probably means that my opponents are simply looking for ways to win the round and aren't actually paying attention to what is actually factually true, judges. They literally completely changed their cases between two of their speeches, which likely means that both of these arguments probably aren't even true in the first place and should be held to a really high threshold, because it forces me to respond to a completely new strategy that was brought up in a 12 minutes of a block speech that I only have 5 minutes to respond to. But even if you don't buy that response, and even if you're still validating that argument, we're going to argue that this isn't going to be true. If we lower the prices of these we're only lowering the prices of new houses. We're not lowering the prices of houses that already exist, of houses that people already own. We're not going to be increasing the rates of mortgage or increasing their interest rates on their loans. But furthermore, maybe these homes are going to be like cheaper when these people are trying to sell their homes. Maybe their value has gone down. But even if that's true, at that point they're probably already looking to move out of the area anyway, and it doesn't really matter if they're not able to afford houses in the area, because by the time that they're trying to sell their house, they're trying to move away anyway. Then they talk about how people living here right now won't be able to afford it. Once again, we're not making people who already talk about how affordable housing has to be based on the median income in the area. They say that this is different based on what area you live in. Yes, that's why it's adjusted towards your district. They talk about how investors are going to find loopholes. Once again, they're literally going to be completely fined or put out of business or forced to file for bankruptcy if they don't follow these regulations, which probably means that they're going to be afraid of breaking these regulations. Now, we talk about how gentrification is happening in the status quo, and they talk about how we let programmers in. But Judge, these programmers, it's only the highest of the programmers that are able to come into California right now in the status quo. We make sure that some of those more middle income ones can come in, which decreases gentrification because it's no longer such a highly concentrated area of solely the most affluent people. But in addition, we also open the opportunity for all the homeless people that we agree exist and are suffering right now to actually have access to homes. Then they talk about how we make the assumption that people of color are automatically poor when we talk about gentrification happening in Oakland. No, Judge, we're only talking about how people of color are already facing gentrification right now and are already facing issues like police brutality, and to the point which my opponents literally say that we increase prices, which causes quote-unquote well-educated people who most likely are white to come into the United States. That probably means that they're biting into this even more so than we ever would be because they literally make the assumption that well-educated people are going to be white. But on their second disadvantage about health, firstly, they concede my partner's response that other factors are responsible for things such as mental illnesses and other forms of diseases, which means that you shouldn't be evaluating this argument because we are not the root cause of this, and overpopulation is not the root cause of this. But furthermore, overpopulation already exists. We're simply making sure that those who already live here actually have a home to live in, so that they're not overpopulating the streets, they're simply populating into houses. Then on their issue of the environment, first of all, in the status quo right now, people already commute 1.5 hours just to get to their jobs right now. We only have a risk of solving. So even if you buy all the articulation that they've made here, these impacts don't need to be weighed as heavily as the impacts that we've isolated because these are impacts that already exist and that they definitely do not solve for. And because we make sure that these programmers can actually get jobs and houses within the area, we are the only team with any risk of solving for these issues. Now on our advantages, which they basically just cross-apply responses to, you can extend the 4 specific arguments that my partner made as for why this plan text is actually going to decrease prices. The first being that that's literally the law, especially for the larger housing programs that oftentimes exist with over 11 units. Secondly, because even if it's expensive, the increase in housing means that more people at least will have access to housing because housing actually exists. Thirdly, because of supply and demand, which they concede in their most recent speeches is a very real issue. And fourthly, because they provide absolutely no empirics for gentrification, while we're able to tell you that our policy affects 43% of the land within large cities within California right now. So for these reasons, we are the only team that can actually isolate and reach any specific impacts or have any chance of solving for those impacts, and have actually stood by a strategy